Welcome to MARC Matters, a monthly TV series produced by MARC Inc. of Manchester that focuses on people with disability, their lives, living in the community. My name is Thomas McCann, your host for MARC Matters, and we have two very special guests, Lowell Weicker and John Doyle. We'll talk about current issues affecting people with disability. I'd like to welcome Mr. Lowell and Mr. Doyle.
Tom, good to be with you.
It's a privilege to have you on the show. Well, Mr. Weicker, what public office have you held over the years?
Tom, I started off as a state representative from Greenwich, Connecticut. And at the same time, I also became the first selectman of Greenwich. And then in 1968, was elected to the Congress from the 4th District of Connecticut. In 1970 to the United States Senate, where I spent 18 years. And then in 1990, was elected governor of the state. So I don't think there are any other offices that you can run for, and I loved every one of them. And each one taught me, you know, as I was going along, more about our state and the people in it.
Well, I know that you were very good on helping people with disability.
Well, you know where I learned that? We had a wonderful governor, Democratic governor, by the name of John Dempsey. And John was the first one that focused on people with disabilities, both at Mansfield and at Southbury. And you know how he did that? Every Christmas there was a pageant at Southbury. And that pageant, Christmas pageant, used to be televised. So for the first time, people in the state of Connecticut saw what wonderful people and what wonderful actors the young men and women of Southbury were.
I've been up to Southbury with Gene Bowen. And right now, I feel that some of the places that I've seen weren't very kept up very well.
Oh, I think that's right. That's right. I haven't been to Southbury lately, but certainly when I was in the state legislature, also when I became governor, both Mansfield and Southbury needed a lot of work done. Well, what we did was to close Mansfield, so it's no longer there. Now, as I say, I hope they're taking care of Southbury.
Well, People Force of Connecticut is trying to close Southbury down.
Okay.
But some of the people that live in Southbury now don't want it shut down.
Yeah, that's tough. You know and I know the best thing you can do with people with disabilities is to let them live a normal life in a community, just like you do.
Yes.
On the other hand, some of the men and women in Southbury, they've been there their whole lives, and they feel they can't go anywhere else. So that's a very tough decision to make. Now, it's going to be made. The day is going to come when Southbury is closed and everybody is in the community. And I hope that day comes soon.
I hope so, too. Why in the U.S. Senate, you also chair the subcommittee on the handicap. Can you tell us about the community's work?
Well, I think the easy way to describe it is that when I was in the Senate, which would have been the early 70s, people really didn't know much about individuals with handicaps. And two things sort of happened around that time. Eunice Shriver started Special Olympics.
Yes.
And so for the first time, Americans had the chance to see young men and women compete in athletics. And they couldn't believe what they saw because they were saying, well, these people can't do athletics, but they did do them. And they did them well. Also at that time, whereas she was doing Special Olympics, I decided in the Senate we had to concentrate on laws to help people with disabilities. So the subcommittee on the handicapped had that job. Today, I'm sorry to say the subcommittee is no more. But at that time, at least got the ball rolling to help people with disabilities.
Well, when you were governor, you did a lot for people with handicap, and I thank you for that too.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. But believe me, what I did is only a little speck. In the United States, unless the people of the United States want to do something, nothing gets done. And I go back to the old example again of Eunice Shriver, Eunice Kennedy Shriver. In the first Special Olympics, maybe there were, 50 people. Nowadays, there are hundreds of thousands of people both participating and watching. My own son, Sonny Weicker, who lives in Chester, Connecticut, he participates in the Special Olympics. He swims. As a matter of fact, I was in Sonny's house yesterday, and I see all these gold medals, hanging on the wall, and he's so proud of them. Now, Sonny and about, I'd say maybe 20 other young men and women all live in Chester, and you can see them. They're walking on the streets of Chester. They go into the restaurants in Chester, the stores in Chester. They live a normal life in the community. That only happened within really the last 30 years. So that's why it's so important to keep our focus on what needs to be done. Now, I know we're going to talk about other laws. We're going to talk about the ADA. We're going to talk about Education of All the Handicapped Children Act, all the laws that have been passed, but all the laws in the United States have really only been passed in the last 30 years. And the great credit, there are a lot of things maybe we don't do well as a nation, but I will tell you one thing. No country in the world has better laws on the books for the disabled, for the handicapped, than the United States of America.
I understand that an important hearing was held in 1981 with Bob Call, Tom Bellamy, and Karen Green, who urged you to move people out of institutions. What do you recall about that hearing?
Well, Tom, I don't, first of all, don't remember this, you're talking to an old man. I'm 78 years old. So, old people like myself, we forget things. But one thing I do remember, I remember 3 people here in the state of Connecticut who really were in the lead on closing institutions or advocating to get people out of institutions. One was a man by the name of Tom Nerney. Another was Elliot Dober. I don't know if you knew any of these people.
I know Tom Nerney.
And you know Elliot?
I know Elliot.
Yeah, there you go. And Peg Dignati.
And I know Peg Dignati.
Well, they're the 3 people that you should keep in mind as to, closing or advocating for the closing of institutions. So, and believe me when I tell you this, even though they were all friends of mine, they were absolutely firm in insisting that I help them get people out of institutions and close institutions. They are terrific.
Tom Nooney is still want to get people out of institutions.
Yep.
It's not like that he wants to keep people in. We have a person in Danbury, Connecticut, and he was in the institution, but now he has his own home, he hires his own staff, and he's doing good.
Well, that's great news. Great news.
During the 80s, you sent your staff all over the country to investigate state institutions. What did they report back?
What you probably would guess they reported back, that the institutions were terrible and the treatment of people was terrible. And again here, the advantage of having a hearing was this was broadcast all over the country. The average American really never knew what went on inside these institutions. And it was high time they learned, and that was the purpose of the hearing. To go ahead and demonstrate that far from any love or any care, these people were just mistreated, and horribly so. So that was the hearing, and that's what came out in the hearing. I know John Doyle, we got to let this guy speak. He can speak.
Thought I was going to get a free ride here today, Tom.
Right. But John will tell you about those hearings.
No, we're not going to let you get a free ride, John.
All right. Well, the hearings, as Senator Weicker said, produced results that were just astounding. They were awful. And the senator called to the carpet the man in the Justice Department that was supposed to be enforcing civil rights, and pointed out to him how he wasn't doing it. The senator called on the carpet the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, who was supposed to be enforcing the inspection of these facilities and wasn't doing it. And as a result, there was a whole new order of inspections, of trained personnel in the district offices, and a new law, the Protection of Mentally Ill People, which the senator sponsored, to address the conditions in the institutions. Having said that, that was sort of like putting a Band-Aid on a tumor. It wasn't going to cure it. The only cure for those large institutions was what we've seen with Mansfield, the closing, and that's what the senator did when he became governor. But in those days, just to make it better, there were several initiatives that the senator proposed that became law and that were enforced.
So all institutions were law. Is that correct?
All institutions were found to be, all the institutions we looked at, and we had one investigator, the senator, remember, actually worked undercover. Yep. He got a job in one of the institutions and was there for 4 or 5 weeks, a man named Steve Snyder, an experienced investigator. And we found instances of abuse and neglect at every institution that we visited across the country.
Mm. Very interesting, very interesting. No wonder why all institutions are going downhill instead of uphill.
Well, yeah, because that's easy, because people don't want to spend any money on them. I mean, after all, why should we, I'm not saying this is what I think, but too many people think, why should we spend money on the disabled? I want to spend money on, quote, normal, men and women. What everybody fails to understand is we're all Americans. And just as John mentioned, civil rights, we all have the same rights. And by rights, I mean to happiness and to living a productive life. We don't divide on that. And yet in terms of money, people say the money should go to those that are healthy rather than those that have a problem. And I bet you if you had an investigation today of these institutions, you'd find a lot of them, even today, are mistreating the people inside.
Well, I know I've gone up to Southbury with the commissioner, and they're actually now fixing up Southbury. But I've walked into some, and they're atrocious. They're like, they haven't swept up the floors. One of the staff members put laundry on a kid's stomach. Okay, let's get back to the reports of the investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Were they ever publicized?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Believe me, it was publicized. The sad thing to say, Tom, it was publicized. Everybody was shocked, and probably in a week's time, everybody forgot about it. I mean, you know, these things require constant attention. You can't do it all in just 1 week. People don't stick with the subject. I mean, that's what I love about Special Olympics, is that there are the local Special Olympics, there's the regional Special Olympics, there's the state Special Olympics and the national Special Olympics, so that really it's kept these great young men and women athletes are in front of the American public all year. Well, I don't think the institutions of America are in front of the American public all year. And if they were, there'd be a lot of reform, and there would be a lot of closing of institutions. I'm glad to hear your story about going to Southbury. I mean, nobody is more experienced or knows more than you about, you know, the disabled, because you've lived through it, so you see other people living through it, so you know what needs to be done.
I have talked to people in institutions, and they told me at Southbury that they want to get out.
There you go.
And I asked them, well, why can't you get out? And they said to me, because they like it there.
Because they what?
They like it there.
Well, I think that, don't forget, if you're going to let people out, then you have to have the facilities waiting for them on the outside.
Well, I agree with you. Public Law 94-142, now known as Individuals with Disability Education Act, face massive resistance. During President Reagan's term, why the resistance given to thousands of letters in support of it?
All right. First of all, I knew this law as the Education of All Handicapped Children, Education for All Handicapped Children Act. That was its original name. I like the original name because it reminds me of the fact that until that law was passed, people with disabilities couldn't get an education in a public school. I mean, if you can believe it, in the United States, children could not get a public school education. My son, Sonny Weicker, has been educated under that law. Mm-hmm. And indeed, since that law has been passed, which goes to show that, you know, sometimes good things apply to everybody. That law worked and the disabled started to mainstream in our society because they had an education. Because at work, we passed another law called Birth to 3, which means that young disabled men and women were educated literally from the time they were born. And we now know, it used to be that people said, well, education only counts for anybody when you're in your teens. We now know it counts the minute you're born. So I just can't emphasize more strongly the importance of education for the disabled. And I can't emphasize more strongly the fact that when they start giving out the public school money, the public school systems, most of them, try to duck under the law and not give that education to disabled children. Which brings me to the last point, which is everybody thinks that sort of warm and fuzzy thoughts about Ronald Reagan. I don't have any warm and fuzzy thoughts about Ronald Reagan. He tried to cut this program so that the education would not be available. And I think that, I thank God that even up to today, at least the law is on the books. Whether or not people are paying attention, that remains to be seen. John, maybe you'd have a comment here.
Well, the only thing I'd add, Senator, is that in direct answer to your question, Tom, I don't think people here in Connecticut or around the country really knew what then President Reagan had proposed, namely to repeal this law, do away with it, take it off the books, and to cut the funding way, way back. Senator Weicker and our staff did a lot of work to inform people, to let people like you know, to let people like Ed Pernetta that runs the State DD Council here in Connecticut know what was going on and that they should contact their elected officials and make sure they oppose what the then president was trying to do. And Senator Weicker led that fight, and it was a long fight. In your question, you asked about the thousands of letters that were sent. Well, those were only sent after Senator Weicker asked people that were concerned to send them.
So, in other words, it seems like you guys didn't get any response back.
Not initially.
Positive response.
Not initially, that's right. And but it did come. And it came in the form of letters, came in the form of protests, and finally, President Reagan and his education secretary backed down, and they stopped trying to repeal the law and repeal the regulations and cut the funding. But it was a long fight.
Okay. There currently is no comparable subcommittee in the handicap in the Senate. Do you have any thoughts on how one can be reinstated?
Sure, go ahead and ask your senators to reinstate it. Look, you know, this is a democracy. What people feel, you know, can become law or become custom. And as far as I'm concerned, people of the state of Connecticut ought to stand right up and say this subcommittee, you know, ought to be a regular part of the organization of the United States Senate. That's the only way it's going to happen.
Well, I know that now that we have all self-advocacy, we tell all the people to call the Senate, call the legislators, and tell them what you want. And it seems like it's doing it, and we're telling them to speak up for themselves.
Excellent.
Couldn't be better.
Because nobody else
Right.
can speak up for them.
That's right. Exactly right.
Bipartisanship is at an all-new low in the government. Do you have any regrets, any suggestions for the future?
Boy, that's a tough question, because I know that the easy answer, Tom, would be to say we ought to be more bipartisan. But the problem with that is that bipartisanship means that people are continually bringing ideas to the Senate or to the House, and they're arguing about those ideas. And if you don't have any argument, then everybody's going in the same direction. I think John would be the first to agree that the 70s and 80s were a great era for disabilities legislation. But that only came after, a lot of pulling and hauling. And it finally ended with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, let me give you an example within the disabilities community itself. As John knows, and he has really a lot of experience here, the disabled themselves couldn't agree on what law should be passed. So they were pulling and hauling among themselves. Finally, one by one, they all got together to write the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I love good times and bipartisanship, but I like new ideas, and I like pulling and hauling, and then coming to a good solution, as was the case with the ADA.
What are your greatest achievements in the disability legislation?
Well, you said it yourself. And you're a living example for the disabled to be in our communities, to live as you live. 40 years ago, you'd be in an institution. You wouldn't have a chance to do what you're doing now. Here you are, the host of a famous talk show, living in the community. Well, that happened because the law was changed.
Do you have any regrets?
No, not when it comes to disabilities law. I regret the fact that I'm 78 years old.
Well, you don't look 78. You look like you're only 26.
God bless you, Tom.
Okay, I'd like to thank John Doyle and Lowell Weicker for being on my show. If you want any more information, please call MARC Inc. of Manchester, or call 860-646-5718. And I want to thank you and see you next time.